Robert Campeau acquired Federated Department Stores in 1988 for approximately $6.6 billion in a hostile takeover that was, at the time of its completion, the largest leveraged buyout in the history of American retail. Campeau had built his fortune in Canadian real estate development before turning his attention to American retail acquisitions, completing the acquisition of Allied Stores Corporation in 1986 for approximately $3.6 billion, before pursuing Federated, whose portfolio of department store chains included Bloomingdale's, Macy's predecessor relationships, and dozens of other regional department store brands across the United States. The Federated acquisition was financed almost entirely with debt, junk bonds, bank loans, and bridge financing assembled through a capital structure whose aggregate leverage exceeded what the combined Allied and Federated retail operations cash flows could service under any market condition the retail sector was likely to produce. Campeau Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in January 1990, 15 months after the Federated acquisition's completion. It was, at the time, one of the fastest collapses of a major leveraged buyout in American corporate history, comparable in its compression to the Aladdin's 13-month bankruptcy documented in Case File 045, though produced by an entirely different mechanism. Not a demand shock, but a debt structure whose service requirements had exceeded the acquired business's cash flow generation capacity from the moment the transaction closed. The forensic entry point for this case is not merely the speed of the collapse, though the speed is forensically significant. It is the specific institutional pattern that Robert Campeau's career documents. A real estate developer whose Canadian commercial real estate success had been built on leverage deployed in markets, whose appreciation trajectory had validated aggressive debt structures, applying the same leverage philosophy to American retail acquisitions, whose underlying businesses operated according to fundamentally different financial dynamics than the real estate development model that had produced his initial fortune. Campeau understood leverage. He did not understand retail, that distinction and the specific mechanism by which it produced one of the fastest and most consequential leveraged buyout failures in American corporate history is the forensic subject of this case file. If this is your first case file from this channel, subscribe now, because every episode adds one more layer to what you are about to understand about the architecture of institutional failure. Robert Campeau's acquisition strategy for both Allied Stores and Federated Department Stores applied a financial framework developed in Canadian commercial real estate development to an industry, American department store retail, whose financial characteristics were fundamentally incompatible with that framework. Campeau's real estate development career had been built on a specific leverage thesis: acquire or develop real estate assets using debt size to the asset's appreciation potential rather than to its current cash flow generation, with the expectation that the underlying real estate's value appreciation across the holding period would generate the equity returns that justified the leverage, regardless of whether the asset's operating cash flows alone could service the debt. That thesis is viable in markets and asset categories, where appreciation is a reliable and substantial component of the total return, as Canadian commercial real estate had been during the period of Campeau's most significant real estate development successes. It is not viable in operating businesses whose value is determined primarily by operating cash flow generation rather than by asset appreciation. And American department store retail in the late 1980s was exactly this type of business. A mature, competitively pressured industry whose store real estate had some appreciation potential, but whose primary value driver was the operating cash flow that the retail operations generated from merchandise sales. The covenant that Campeau's acquisition financing did not adequately price was the one embedded in the relationship between the leverage his real estate development experience had validated and the cash flow generation capacity that an operating retail business, rather than an appreciating real estate asset, could actually produce. The Federated and Allied Stores acquisitions were financed with debt sized to a real estate appreciation thesis, applied to operating businesses whose primary financial characteristic was operating cash flow rather than asset appreciation. The department store real estate underlying Federated's operations did have value, and Campeau's transaction structure incorporated real estate monetization strategies, including sale-leaseback transactions on specific properties that were intended to generate the capital required to service the acquisition debt. Those real estate monetization strategies generated some capital. They did not generate capital at the scale or with the speed that the acquisition debt service requirements demanded, because the retail real estate market of 1988 and 1989 was not experiencing the appreciation trajectory that Campeau's Canadian real estate development experience had led him to expect. At what point does an acquirer's success in one asset category create a dangerous overconfidence when applying the same financial framework to a fundamentally different category? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The appraisal methodology that supported the Campeau acquisitions of Allied Stores and Federated Department Stores reflected a specific category of valuation error that this channel has not previously documented with this precision: the application of a real estate asset valuation framework to a retail operating company whose value the acquirer's financial advisors and lending syndicate had not adequately distinguished from the underlying real estate's separate valuation. A department store chain's enterprise value is the combination of two substantially distinct value components: the operating business's cash flow generation from merchandise retail operations, and the real estate value of the store locations and any owned distribution and corporate facilities. Those two value components require different valuation methodologies, different risk assessments, and critically, different debt structures, because the operating business's cash flow is subject to the cyclical and competitive risks of retail merchandising, while the real estate's value is subject to the cyclical and locational risks of commercial real estate markets, and the two risk profiles are not perfectly correlated. The appraisal and financing structure that supported the Campeau acquisitions did not adequately separate these two value components in calibrating the acquisition debt structure. The acquisition financing was sized to a blended enterprise value that incorporated both the operating cash flow and the real estate value, without structuring the debt service requirements to reflect the different risk and timing characteristics of each component. The specific consequence of that blending was a debt structure whose near-term service requirements, the interest and principal payments due in the first several years following the acquisition, exceeded what the operating retail business's cash flow alone could generate, requiring the real estate monetization strategies to generate substantial capital on a timeline that the commercial real estate market of 1988 and 1989 did not support. The retail business was being asked to service debt sized to the combined enterprise value, while the actual cash available to service that debt in the near term was limited to the operating cash flow component, a mismatch that produced the specific covenant breach and liquidity crisis that the January 1990 bankruptcy filing documented. The appraisal had not failed to identify the asset's value. It had failed to structure the debt to match the asset's actual cash generation timing. If the forensic analysis this channel conducts is changing how you read real estate headlines, the like button is how the algorithm knows to send this case file to the next analyst who needs it. Robert Campeau's personal response to the deteriorating financial condition of his retail holdings across 1989, in the months preceding the January 1990 bankruptcy filing, documented a specific institutional denial pattern that combined elements this channel has examined in multiple previous case files, with a characteristic specific to Campeau's particular institutional background. Campeau's public statements through 1989 consistently characterized the retail holdings' financial difficulties as temporary liquidity challenges resolvable through the planned real estate monetization strategies, a characterization whose persistence in the face of accumulating evidence of the acquisition debt structure's fundamental mismatch with the operating business's cash flow generation capacity reflected a specific form of institutional denial. The application of a real estate developer's characteristic confidence in eventual asset appreciation to a situation where the near-term cash flow crisis required resolution on a timeline that asset appreciation, even if it eventually materialized, could not address. A real estate developer's professional experience consistently rewards patience through market cycles. Assets that appear distressed in a near-term liquidity sense can be genuinely valuable assets whose patient holding through a market cycle eventually validates the original investment thesis. That professional experience, validated repeatedly across Campeau's Canadian real estate development career, was the specific lens through which he interpreted the Federated and Allied Stores retail holdings' deteriorating financial condition in 1989 as a temporary liquidity challenge that patient capital and continued real estate monetization would eventually resolve, rather than as the symptom of a fundamental debt structure mismatch that the business's operating cash flow generation could never resolve regardless of the patience applied. The institutional denial in this case was therefore not primarily a denial of financial facts that Campeau refused to acknowledge. It was a denial produced by the misapplication of a genuinely validated professional framework, patient capital through real estate market cycles, to a situation whose underlying dynamics, retail operating cash flow generation, rather than real estate appreciation, that framework was not designed to address. The specific lesson that the Campeau collapse should have taught the broader leveraged buyout industry of the late 1980s, that acquisition debt structures must be calibrated to the specific cash flow generation characteristics of the underlying business rather than to a generic leverage thesis validated in a different asset category, was a lesson that the broader leverage buyout industry largely did not learn from Campeau's specific failure, as the subsequent decades' leveraged buyout activity continued to apply similar leverage frameworks to operating businesses across multiple industries with similarly mixed results. Federated Department Stores emerged from Chapter 11 bankruptcy in February 1992, 2 years after Campeau's filing, under a reorganization that eliminated the debt structure Campeau's acquisition had created and that restored the company to a capital structure that its operating cash flow could actually service. The reorganized Federated, which subsequently acquired Macy's in 1994 and continued operating as one of the largest American department store companies for decades, including its eventual corporate rebranding under the Macy's name, demonstrated that the underlying retail businesses Campeau had acquired were genuinely viable operating companies whose failure had been produced by the acquisition debt structure rather than by any fundamental weakness in the businesses themselves. The businesses survived. The acquisition structure that had nearly destroyed them did not. Robert Campeau's personal and corporate financial position did not recover from the Federated and Allied Stores collapse. His subsequent business activities operated at a substantially reduced scale, and his career as a major American business figure effectively concluded with the 1990 bankruptcy filing. What the Campeau collapse reveals in the context of this channel's 66-case archive is a specific failure category that connects to but is distinct from the private equity grand hotel acquisition model documented in case file 061. The application of a leverage philosophy validated in one asset category, real estate development, to an entirely different asset category, retail operating businesses whose cash flow generation dynamics the acquirer's professional experience had not adequately prepared him to evaluate. The title's reference to exits without a lesson reflects the specific historical observation that the broader leveraged buyout industry's subsequent decades of activity did not substantially incorporate the specific lesson the Campeau collapse should have taught. That debt structure calibration requires precise attention to the specific cash flow generation characteristics and timing of the underlying acquired business, rather than the application of a generic leverage framework validated in a different context. The businesses Campeau acquired survived him. The lesson his collapse should have taught, the industry largely did not. If this case file changed how you evaluate the application of leverage philosophies across different asset categories, subscribe, because the next case examines what happens when the same mismatch occurs in the entertainment industry rather than in retail. And in the comments, given Campeau's documented misapplication of real estate leverage philosophy to retail operating business acquisition, what specific due diligence requirement would have identified the cash flow timing mismatch before the acquisition financing was finalized? The case file is open. This content was developed using artificial intelligence tools as part of the research, writing, and production process. All AI-generated material was subject to human review, editorial intervention, and approval before publication. Factual claims, interpretive framing, creative direction, and final content decisions reflect human judgment throughout. This disclosure is provided in accordance with platform transparency standards for AI-assisted content.